this is a very interesting series of seminars we are holding, perhaps some singularly hosted by the World Bank or the World Bank Tokyo office, but occasionally jointly hosted by many of our partners. And today we are very, very happy that the Ogata Institute has been very kind to offering this opportunity, and thank you. I would like to personally thank Mr. Makino for the arrangement, as well as his valuable comments. I understand he will share with us. And also we'd like to thank Professor Ito. He has been a great colleague of ours, if you don't mind. We have been working together for some time now, and today we are very happy again to have him as a commentator on this report. And this World Development Report, as you know, is a flagship report of the World Bank, and we have treated a number of interesting issues, and this year is no exception, of course. Data availability, as well as a new social contract, as I understand, to obtaining and formulating effectively and efficiently what would be the most critical element in policy making. It is often said that you know, economic policy making is like driving a car with a rear view mirror, because almost by definition, data are a product of, or reflection rather, of what had already happened. But let's think about the situation where we don't even have a rear view mirror, or perhaps a distorted image on the rear view mirror. But that's what we are facing, actually. A very scary driving condition, but it is what we are facing in many of our developing countries and partners. So how can we improve this situation is the theme of today's seminar, as well as this year's report. And we would like to thank our colleagues from the headquarters, Washington, Vivian, Dean, and Malar. They are chief authors of the report, and of course, some very knowledgeable experts in this field. So, you know, we look forward to hearing all the new insights, all the new innovative solutions they propose, and of course, comments from Messrs. Ito and Makino, and in particular from JICA's perspective, I would like to hear what on the ground JICA is facing due to the lack of data, and of course, from the academic perspective, Mr. Ito would give us a very insightful and valuable, relevant comments, I'm sure. So without further ado, I would like to I'd like all the audience and participants to enjoy today's seminar. And thank you again. And please come back to our series of seminars in the future as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Miyazaki, for your opening remarks. For the next 40 minutes, we'll listen to the keynote presentation by the WDR 2021 co-director Vivian Foster, the chief economist for infrastructure of the World Bank, and Dean Jolliffe, the lead economist in data group of the World Bank. From the team also, Mala Berapan, the WDR manager and senior data scientist of the World Bank, is also with us this morning, and she will join us for the Q&A and discussion part later. If you have questions to the WDR co-directors or points to make about the report, please post your questions or comment on the Q&A section on the Zoom screen. You can post in English or in Japanese. I'll read them during the Q&A part later during the seminar, and I'll ask the speakers to respond. With that, I would like to ask Vivian and Dean to come in to start your keynote presentation. Vivian and Dean, please.
Super. So thank you so much. First, good morning and perhaps good afternoon and good evening for some folks there. My name's Dean Jolliffe. I'm from the data group at the World Bank. I'm one of the 3 co-directors of the 2021 World Development Report, Data for Better Lives. On behalf of my co-directors, Bob Cull from the research group and Vivian Foster, Chief Economist for Infrastructure, and our report manager, Malar Verapan, we thank you all and we thank the organizers for today's event for giving us the opportunity to present an overview of the report. So next slide, please. I'll start with an example to convey what we mean when we say data for better lives. In 1999, a cyclone hit the state of Odisha in India, killing 10,000 people. In response to this tragedy, the government, realizing that they could have done more to prevent this outcome, invested in the Odisha State Disaster Management Authority. The authority was tasked with creating better systems to collect, process, and analyze weather data, creating valuable information, and then disseminating that information quickly enough that it could affect outcomes. When a similar sized cyclone hit Odisha in 2013, the capture, processing, and broadcasting of the warning data led to the successful evacuation of nearly 1 million people, saving countless thousands of lives. Next slide. In the case of Odisha, it was the collection, processing, and analytics of data by government that led to better outcomes, but other actors can use data to improve lives. To guide our thinking in the report, we use the following conceptual framework where we have 3 primary pathways by which data is produced and which by data can lead to better outcomes for people. The key 3 sets of actors are governments and international organizations running through the center of this diagram, people, civil society, and academia running along the top channel, and the private sector in the bottom channel. Next slide. There are many examples of data being produced and used through the other pathways that lead to improved lives. So one example of this from Egypt, running through the very top channel in our diagram, is HarassMap. This is a citizen-led initiative to map out individual reports of sexual harassment in an effort to promote change and to create safe spaces. Other examples include initiatives like Report a Bribe, which was started in India, where citizens reported bribes being demanded, and these data were then structured and mapped in ways that help identify the perpetrators and thereby help to reduce corruption. Next slide. All 3 of these actors are producers of data, from firms gathering information about transactions, governments collecting data from administration of programs, from program delivery, and from policies, and to citizens generating data in ways that help empower them as described above. Next slide. When civil society, individual citizens, academia use data, they can be a powerful force to create greater transparency and accountability of both public and private sectors. When governments use data, they can improve policies, programs, administration, design and evaluation, and service delivery. And when private firms use data, they can improve decision-making, market efficiency, and better match supply with demand. All of this can lead to economic growth. Next slide. Of course, many of us are people who are enthusiastic believers in the power of data to help people, but we also very clearly recognize that data is a double-edged sword. It has great potential to also harm people. We devote a lot of our thinking to these issues, in part because we think without properly addressing these concerns, this future where data is a powerful, positive force is really in jeopardy. So in the second part of the report, we bring a lot of focus to how to navigate and act against the potential harmful uses of data. Next slide. We use this general framework of thinking about the 3 different actors and each of these different channels to produce these better outcomes as a vehicle for helping us to think about this report. But we also recognize that there are many other data reports out there that have focused on these issues, at least in terms of how they affect rich countries. So a distinction then of this report, of the 2021 World Development Report, is our focus on how these issues affect poorer people and poorer countries. So concerns about data equity, for example, are particularly relevant to poorer people who are less likely to be reflected in data and to have access to data and to participate in the data economy. Concerns about trust are also salient in poorer countries, where institutional and regulatory frameworks that ensure safe and ethical use of data are typically weaker. Next slide. Another way in which we believe the focus of this report differs from other reports is that we directly build into our framework a significant emphasis on the central attribute of data. That is that once it's used, it doesn't diminish the ability to use data again. Data is completely reusable. And yet data is frequently used once and filed away. And this lack of reusing data tends to be particularly pronounced in poorer countries. And so for this reason, we assert in the report that much of the value of data to improve lives is left untapped. An important message of the report is that we all need to work on finding ways to get more value out of data, find ways to reuse, to repurpose data to provide insights to unexpected problems. This means greater access to data and greater sharing of data. And this is what we're aiming to convey in this middle part of this diagram with the arrows running back and forth across all of the different actors and users in society. Greater use of data can mean something as simple as allowing data to be used more than just once for one purpose. So a simple example of this is in Uganda. Their procurement data, as in many countries, is collected by the government to ensure compliance with government regulations. And typically once collected, it's filed away. In Uganda, though, to improve the procurement outcomes, the local government entities made the administrative procurement data from bidding process to the execution of contracts available to civil society organizations. These civil society organizations trained community members to understand the information in the contracts and conduct site checks to verify it. The findings led to reforms to ensure that the contracts comply with national procurement standards and that the National Public Procurement Agency then upgraded its procurement portal to meet international open contracting data norms, making Uganda the first country to do so. So simply by making this procurement data public and training people how to understand and to use it, they improve the efficiency of the public procurement system. Next slide. Another example of reuse and purposing is one that's quite a bit more complicated. It comes from the city government of Nairobi in Kenya, where they leveraged the rapid expansion of social media commuter reports on traffic conditions and used these data as a source of road traffic crash data. Researchers worked with the National Police Service to first digitize more than 10,000 reports from 2013 to 2020 to create a digital geolocated administrative data set of individual crashes in society. They then combined this digitized data with the social media reports, and with overlapping of these two data sources, they were able to identify that 50% of all road traffic deaths were occurring on just 5% of the road area space. They used this information then to design safety features in these unsafe areas and help improve road safety. Next slide. Another example of this, of the joint use of multiple data files, is a case where the overlaying of data files helped to significantly improve the targeting of scarce resources to reach marginalized people and areas. So this is an example in Croatia where data from the population census was combined with household survey data and administrative data to create detailed maps of poverty and deprivations. The maps revealed large differences in living standards across small municipalities within larger regions. So the disbursement of funds from the EU for poverty mitigation had previously depended just on these regional measures of gross domestic product per capita, which meant that resources were not reaching poor municipalities situated in non-poor regions. When they were able to combine these different data sources and create a much more granular map of poverty, they were able to use this information to persuade the EU to change the rules by which the dispersion of funds took place so that they could now target specific municipalities, reaching more of the poor municipalities across the country. Next slide. We use this framework overall here as a model to advocate for greater production, access, and use of data to create value from data in ways that improve lives. But why would people be willing to participate in calls for the collecting, sharing, use, and reuse of data, particularly in the presence of all the potential negative ways in which data can be used to harm people? Next slide. In the report, we argue that one large part of the answer lies in the realization of a new social contract for data. By developing a social contract for data, we mean that countries need to get all of society to engage in a dialogue around developing agreements among participants and the rules and process of creating, sharing, and reusing data. In the following slides, I'll describe what we believe to be the core building blocks of the social contract. Next slide. First, any sort of agreement that requires that the participants have something to gain from the contract. That is, that there's value that's created through the agreement. Realizing greater value from data requires both that more people have access to data and that the data is shared more, reused more, and repurposed to solve new problems. The report offers many examples of this taking place. Next slide. Value alone is not enough, though. There needs to be a sense that all participants will benefit in some of the value. In the report, we note that poor people in poor countries are often not beneficiaries, and for a social contract to be sustainable, all people must benefit in some way from participating. Next slide. Finally, without trust, people will not participate. People need to trust that the value that it is created from the contract, that they will share in some of the benefits, and that they will not be harmed. They need to trust also in the integrity of the data. Well, trust will be established primarily through credible laws and enforcement mechanisms governing the fair use and just use of data. Trust will also come when people start recognizing that data is being used more effectively to improve well-being. So in particular, when we read polls about people's distrust in data and facts, it's clear that improving trust will require a lot of work in many different dimensions. Next slide. So as one small step in this direction, we're releasing with the report an open data measure of the performance of data and statistical systems within all countries of the world. The statistical performance indicators. We've developed these measures with an eye on the future and not the past, which means that there's relatively more emphasis on the development and use of data and not just the production of statistics. It's meant to cover both national statistical systems and reflects our first efforts at capturing data systems and data transparency. So the aim of this measure is to help countries understand and see relative blind spots and to create incentives to improve. Next slide. The measure, the SPI, rests on 5 pillars: data use, services, products, sources, and infrastructure. And then within each of these pillars, it's decomposable into several different dimensions and further decomposable into more indicators. A central feature of the SPI is that the data need to be used and that the data need to be accessible. Hidden, undocumented data will always score poorly in the SPI. Next slide. The global profile of SPI scores reveal that most of the worst performers are in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, reasonably consistent with average national incomes, and as such, perhaps not so surprising. Next slide. But once we break down these regions into country-level performance, we see quite a different picture. Even though there are very sharp differences in regional averages, when we look inside each region, we observe a tremendous amount of variation in statistical performance across countries within each region. So certainly a takeaway message from this slide is that there's a lot of work to do in each and every region of the world. Next slide. Finally, this slide is meant to convey simply that while SPI, the statistical performance, is strongly correlated with a country's gross domestic product, there are many other factors that affect SPI. So in this figure, we're plotting a country's statistical performance score after controlling for their income level. So all of the green dots on top reflect countries whose statistical performance is greater than the average performance of all countries at similar income levels. So for example, we've highlighted Mexico. A country whose SPI score is equal to the average score of countries that are twice as rich as Mexico. In terms of statistical performance, Mexico is performing like a country that is twice as rich as it is. The idea here is to learn from under and over performers and to help understand where and how countries can make improvements. Next slide. So this SPI discussion was one example of the way in which we need to improve trust in the performance of data. We note that the SPI is a tool for improving transparency, and it's clear that it's one part of building up a social contract. But we recognize that establishing this social contract is going to be a significant and difficult undertaking. And the report, we're very clear that social contracts will be different in all countries, reflecting the heterogeneity of cultures, values, and laws. But we assert that all contracts need to be based in value, trust, and equity. It's important to recognize that social contracts have existed for centuries. They're reflected in legal systems across the world, but we need these contracts to adapt to this new world where data is deeply interwoven into our lives. Next slide. While the social contract provides the rules and compliance mechanisms for how data can be safely shared, used, and reused by all stakeholders, to realize data's potential, this framework must be built around a data system that not only ensures that safety, but also actively promotes access to data. So Odisha is one example where investing in data systems produced great social value in the way of saved lives, but there are countless other. And the World Development Report offers an aspirational vision of an integrated national data system, or something we're abbreviating as an INDS, which can serve to enhance data flows across different stakeholders, allowing all to benefit from data use and facilitating innovative, creative new uses of data to solve existing and emerging problems. Well, it's clear that most of the countries that are the focus of our report are very far away from this aspiration. It's nonetheless important to provide a clear description of what countries should be aiming for as they take steps towards improving their use of data. So in the report, we devote several chapters to each of the components of a well-functioning data system. In the following slides, I'll just quickly convey some of the key aspects of the INDS. Next slide. The focus is on increasing access to data. This focus on increasing access to data places greater emphasis on several attributes of data. We expand on what this means in the report, but the summary expression of this is that data must be produced, protected against misuse. It has to be quality controlled. It has to be open. It has to be used and reused. Next slide. An integrated system has to facilitate the flow of data across all participants, with each participant both using and creating data. Next slide. The report discusses in detail several important aspects of data governance, and Vivian is going to expand on each of these. Next slide. And finally, we assert that the sustainability of the data systems rests on foundational elements of data demand, funding, incentives, human capital, and trust. In summary, the integrated national data system is built on an intentional, whole of government, multi-stakeholder approach to data governance, and to expand on the elements of what we mean by data governance, I'm going to hand it over now to our other co-director of the World Development Report, Vivian Foster. Vivian, all yours.
Thank you very much, Dean. It's very good to be here with everybody in Tokyo. If we can go to the next slide. We've heard a lot about the social contract and the integrated national data system, and these are very useful conceptual framing of the data challenge. However, what does it really mean in practice? What are the concrete steps that countries need to take in terms of data governance to to actually implement the social contract and move towards an integrated national data system? The whole second half of the World Development Report treats the issue of data governance, unpacking it in considerable detail. We believe that data governance can usefully be separated into 4 distinct pillars: infrastructure policies, laws and regulations, economic policies, and institutions. And we'll be looking at each of these in turn. But before we do so, we'd like to emphasize that the social contract for data, while it may primarily be a national affair, also has very important international dimensions. And without an international dimension to that social contract, we will fail to really reap the full potential that data has to offer for the development agenda. This international cooperation can take place either bilaterally between countries, regionally, or globally. An illustration of bilateral cooperation around data is when, for example, law enforcement agencies collaborate to address a cybersecurity concern, or when tax administrations collaborate to collect value-added tax from a digital platform business. Turning to the regional level, we see considerable scope for the development of regional data infrastructure, particularly in low-income regions of the world, where countries may be too small to develop their own data infrastructures. Such regional integration calls also for connectivity in terms of cross-border fiber optic networks towards shared data facilities, as well as harmonization of regional data regulations that would allow the data to flow within a regional system. We also see scope for regional cooperation in that developing countries need to band together in order for their voice to be adequately heard in global debates relating to data governance, which affect their interests. And finally, at the global level, there is an important need for data governance decisions relating to key free rider problems, such as the issue of corporate taxation of digital platforms or the trading rules around data-enabled services. So while the remainder of our discussion will be mainly at the national level, please bear in mind that this is also an international challenge. Let's go to the next slide and introduce the topic of infrastructure policies. Now, infrastructure policies are particularly helpful to support the achievement of equity in the social contract. Without access to infrastructure, poor people are unable to access the data system or to have their own data captured into the data system. At the same time, infrastructure helps to ensure equity between countries because the development of domestic data infrastructure at the national level turns out to be an important factor for equitable participation in the data economy. Let's consider each of these aspects in turn. Next slide. When it comes to universal broadband coverage, the world has made considerable progress in extending the digital signal across all areas of population, with the exception of sub-Saharan Africa, where a significant coverage gap still remains. Nevertheless, despite this progress, we find that about 40% of the world's population, 40, lives within range of a digital signal, but does not make use of data services. This usage gap is not only large, but also stubborn and has not been coming down over recent years. We think that this usage gap reflects the presence of demand-side barriers to the uptake of internet service, which we will discuss in a moment. But here I'd just like to illustrate from the African continent. In the chart, the orange area represents the population that is not covered, the coverage gap. And you'll see that in countries like Sudan, Guinea, and Burkina Faso, a very large majority of the population is simply not covered by the signal. But on the other hand, if you turn to the right-hand side of the chart, you'll see in green the usage gap, the people who have access but don't use the service. And you'll see that in countries like Rwanda, Ethiopia, and Mozambique, that is where the majority of the population find themselves. Let's turn to the next slide. So if universal service policy does not address demand-side barriers, it is unlikely to achieve the goals of universal use and access to data. According to extensive survey evidence, the main reasons why people do not take up data services are twofold. The first reason is lack of digital literacy. And you can see here on the left-hand side of the chart, the blue area is the percentage of the population reporting that they have digital literacy problems, preventing them from using data services. And this is a majority of the population in countries like Lesotho, Senegal, and Nigeria. On the other hand, if you look to the right-hand side of the chart, you'll see that in countries like Rwanda, Tanzania, and Mozambique, the real problem is the green area, which represents affordability. A majority of the population cannot afford data services. Therefore, universal service policies will increasingly need to tackle these two fundamental barriers. Next slide. We turn now to the issue of domestic data infrastructure. By this, we mean internet exchange points. They are marked on the map in blue, as well as co-location data centers for storage in red, and as well as on-ramps or presence of cloud computing services. These three types of digital infrastructure, IXPs, data centers, and cloud computing, have become critical enablers of participation in the data economy. And countries that lack this type of infrastructure will find themselves sending their domestic data overseas in order to be exchanged, to be stored, or to be processed. And this international data transaction adds to the cost of data services by about 10 times. So it's 10 times more costly. And it also greatly reduces the speed and reliability of data services. As you can see from the map, data infrastructures represented by red and blue dots are heavily concentrated in North America, Western Europe, and Northeast Asia. But for much of the developing world, this type of infrastructure is relatively sparse, and there is a need to work with the private sector to create the enabling environment needed for these data infrastructures to be established. Next slide. We turn now to the second pillar of data governance, which is the laws and regulations governing the use of data. And here we will be distinguishing between two types. The first type is the safeguards. These are the laws and regulations that protect data and engender the trust that Dean was talking about in the social contract. The second type of data regulation are the enablers. And these are the rules that facilitate the free flow and sharing of data among different stakeholders for the purposes of value creation. So clearly, both of these elements are very important in any country's domestic data social contract. Next slide. I think we have had a very vivid illustration of the importance of these two types of regulations in the context of the COVID pandemic. Initially, when it came to contact tracing, and now more recently, vaccination passports, there were issues around how to use data such as mobile phone data for the purposes of protecting public health, how to make that possible in terms of enabling the flow of data from the private to the public sector, but then also how to protect that data once it's in the hands of the government to ensure that it is not abused or misused for other purposes. Next slide. As part of the World Development Report, we conducted a global data regulation survey covering 80 countries, and we scored all countries according to their performance on enablers and safeguards. And here we report the results for Sub-Saharan Africa. What we find is that in many countries there is an imbalance. Some countries have gone a long way towards developing safeguards, represented by the red lines on the chart, while other countries have gone a long way towards developing enablers, represented by the green lines on the chart. Relatively few countries have done as well as Nigeria at the top of the page there, with a balanced development of both types of regulations. Next slide. The data regulation survey allows us to unpack the performance of each country on data regulation according to 7 dimensions. In the area of enablers, we look at e-commerce transactions, enabling use of public and private intent data. And in the area of safeguards, we look at personal and non-personal data protection, as well as cybersecurity and cross-border data flows. In this spider chart, the performance of different country income groups is represented by colored lines on the chart. And as you might expect, the richer countries are doing better than the poorer countries. Nevertheless, it's quite clear that even among high-income countries, much remains to be accomplished in completing the regulatory framework for data. And we find areas of systematic neglect, and that is low scores on the spider chart, including enabling the use of private intent data, protecting non-personal data, and providing clear regulations for cross-border data flows. Next slide. The third pillar of data governance is the economic policies. And given that more and more economic activities are migrating onto digital platforms, any laws and regulations governing data will have an important knock-on effect for the real economy in areas of competition, trade, and taxation. And we'll examine now each of these briefly. In the next slide, we comment on the fact that on the global dominance of a handful of large US-based tech firms. Our research revealed that about 40% of all data traffic in the world is passing through the sites of these major firms. We also looked at the top 25 most visited websites across a range of emerging economies appearing here on this chart. And we represent here in colors of those top 25, which ones correspond to the big US tech firms. And you can see that 2/3 of the top 25 most visited sites are these big US tech firms. And in particular, Google, represented in red, accounts for the top 2 or 3 most visited sites across many of these countries. This situation leads to significant concerns about global equity. And this is so for 2 reasons. First of all, the dominant market position of many of these digital platforms, which are subject to these strong network externalities and market dominance effects, raises concerns about consumer exploitation and equity of the allocation of the profits and benefits between the producer and the consumer. Secondly, the global dominance of such large and well-financed firms makes it difficult for smaller and less sophisticated firms, digital platform firms in the developing world to break into these markets, given the dominance of these positions. The World Development Report talks extensively about strengthening competition frameworks for digital platform businesses, as well as enacting data regulation that will support competition in these markets. Next slide. Another important area of economic activity around data is cross-border trade in data-enabled services. This has been the fastest growing area of trade, exhibiting exponential growth in recent years. And this type of trade represents important economic opportunities for developing countries. The example here of the Augmedics firm in Bangladesh is very illustrative. Thanks to a relatively liberal but protected data arrangements flowing between the US and Bangladesh, physicians in the US are able to send the records of their patient consultations through smart glasses back to clerical assistants in Bangladesh, who in real time are able to make the medical records associated with each visit. So this is a very interesting high-tech example of how trade in data-enabled services is becoming increasingly possible. Next slide. In the World Development Report, we examine the data regulation frameworks that facilitate these kind of exchanges. And we identify 3 different schools of cross-border data regulation around the world. At one extreme, in blue on the map, we have the open transfer approach represented very much by the United States, where there is absolutely no government involvement in cross-border flows of data. This is absolutely liberalized, only with some ex-post accountability for firms that fail to comply with their own codes of practice. And as you can see, a number of developing countries have picked up this approach. At the other end of the spectrum, in purple, we have China and Russia, who are adopting a very strong data localization approach with stringent requirements for storage of data locally and quite strong state involvement in authorization of cross-border data transfers. And in an intermediate position in yellow, we have the European Union, we have Japan, India, and much of Latin America, which have adopted a conditional transfers approach, meaning that the government must evaluate the quality of the data protection in the trading partner. And once this has been deemed adequate, trade may proceed without great intervention. So the econometric work conducted for the World Development Report suggested that which of these 3 models is adopted has a significant impact on the extent of cross-border trade in data-enabled services. Next slide. Another critical issue for equity is the taxation of data-driven businesses and digital platforms. The WDR highlights that many developing economies are unable to capture the tax revenues that ought to be theirs from the activities of these digital platforms. And there are 2 separate concerns. When it comes to value-added tax, the tax rules are clear, but the developing country tax administrations typically lack the capacity and sophistication to collect the revenue from these cross-border digital platforms. And in these East Asian countries, we estimate that the tax administration is losing out billions of dollars of revenue due to this problem. The second and more challenging issue is corporation tax, where there is still a lack of clarity in terms of how the profits that a particular global digital platform makes, how these should be allocated across different jurisdictions for the purposes of taxation. Next slide. The final pillar of data governance is the institutions. And of course, however good the regulatory framework may be, without effective institutions to implement and enforce data regulations, they will be of little value. Next slide. The World Development Report emphasizes the importance of whole of government approaches to data regulation with strong coordination among government entities, as well as a very active engagement with stakeholders across the economy to ensure a full multi-stakeholder governance. In addition to traditional concerns about transparency, functional autonomy, and leadership, data literacy emerges as a very major challenge from this World Development Report. And that is literacy at all levels, from the general public to having adequate professionals available in data science fields, all the way to leadership, policymakers, decision makers, having enough understanding of data to be able to use it to inform decisions effectively. Next slide. The survey work done by the World Development Report revealed a scarcity of data institutions in low-income countries, which are shown on the left-hand side of the charts, versus relative to high-income countries appearing to the right-hand side. So you can see that whether we're talking about data governance entities, data protection authorities, or cybersecurity agencies, lower-income countries are systematically unendowed and underendowed with this type of institutional capacity. So this points to a major capacity building, institutional building agenda for the international community. Next slide, please. So finally, we'd like to leave you with 5 key messages. First of all, we hope that we have convinced you of the need for a new social contract for data founded on the 3 key principles of value, trust, and equity. We also have told a story about the long way the world has to go on data governance. Across the income spectrum, there are huge gaps in the data governance framework that will need to be addressed. Moreover, we hope we've convinced you that data governance is crucially important because of the economic implications it has as more and more economic activities migrate onto digital platforms. We've also stressed that data governance is not just a matter for national policy making, but has crucial elements of international cooperation. And finally, we've laid before you as an aspirational vision the concept of an integrated national data system, something which may still be a long way away for many countries, although we have taken inspiration in the example of Estonia's X-road system, which comes quite close to what we have in mind. But we think it's important that countries have such an aspirational vision to guide their efforts to make progress in this very critical area for the 21st century economy. Thank you so much, and we look forward to engaging with you on questions and comments and discussion.
Thank you very much, Dean and Vivian, for your keynote presentation. Once again, please post your questions and comments on Q&A section on the Zoom screen. I'll read them during Q&A time, asking the speakers to respond. Now, we have 2 distinguished commentators. First, Mr. Koji Makino, Deputy Director of the JICA Sadako Ogata Institute, Research Institute for Peace and Development, who is our co-organizer this morning. Mr. Makino will share his comment for the next 7-8 minutes. Mr. Makino, please.
Yes, I'm Koji Makino, Deputy Director of the JICA Ogata Research Institute, JICA, Japan International Cooperation Agency. Miyazaki 世界銀行駐日代表 and Omori-san and the WDR team are based in Washington, D.C. Thank you very much for your giving me to make the comment on the precious World Bank report this year published. And I'm talking from Tokyo in Japan. myself and most of the people in Japan very much now excited to watch the Olympic game from morning to evening, but silently under the corner. My comment can be divided into two parts. One is a general comment. Another one is data use for peace building based upon the JICA's experience in the field. Sorry, not to the prepare PowerPoint sheet this time. I'm sorry. And then let me start the bubbling. And about the general comment. While COVID-19 is rapidly accelerating use and accumulation of the data, this WDR is quite timely and very, very useful for everybody, I believe. COVID-19 has steeply highlighted data use has a light and a shadow. I highly appreciate and respect tremendous effort and excellent outcome of WDR team World Bank. Congratulations. Thank you very much. I agree that the report wrote alongside capital, land, and labor, data are also an input to development objective. I do think data is indispensable to secure human security too. Human security concept as the JICA core mission aim to pursue and attain the freedom from want, a kind of poverty reduction, freedom from fear, and freedom to live in dignity without appropriate the use of data in the world. People cannot secure such essential freedoms. I also fully agree that we need to form a new social contract, focusing on the value, trust, and equity the World Bank team just presented. Let me discuss the social contract with a bit different angle from my side. Over the past year, JICA Ogata Research Institute has intensively discussed with many eminent scholars like Professor Stiglitz from Columbia University about the new world without the COVID-19. One of the major consensus through the discussion we did is that COVID-19 is accelerating the world to restructure social contract by country and by region. You see, we reach the very similar conclusion, but with a bit different context from what WDR as vital core of social contract. We focus on safety, prosperity, and the freedom. Safety, prosperity, and the freedom. Balance of these cores is likely to change before and after COVID-19. For example, in the case of United States, US, the Trump administration relatively focused on prosperity and freedom, even under the severe circumstances of the pandemic. But the current administration looks to focus on first safety, like that. A social contract is changing. Maybe we could apply vital core of social contract, safety, prosperity, and the freedom to issue the data use too. My impression that this report seems to focus on digital data. It's all right. However, I'd like to stress analog data or the tacit knowledge. Tacit knowledge is also significant from my experience working in the field for a long time. Analog data include feelings on the ground, intuition, face-to-face dialogue, and understanding between lines. Maybe we need to look for the best mix between digital and analog data. For example, in the case of agriculture sector, We cannot produce any agricultural outputs only through digital transformation DX. We do need analog but fatal basic materials such as land, sunshine, water, smell of the soil, and color of the water, such the feeling. We have to keep in mind digital and analog should be mixed and balanced on the ground. So second part, my comment is the data use on the peace building activities. I'd like to play up data issue in light of peace building. JICA is tackling intensively all over the world. Violent extremism is nowadays one of the major factors to internationalize the conflict as the extremism, the goals, and transmit beyond the border, even without the religions. Last decade saw the emergence of decentralized and community embedded armed group in remote area instead of the typical centralized anti-government level group that used to be common during Cold War period. Such a non-state armed groups now have more horizontal structure and competing the leadership. Now we see SNS. SNS is a smart tool to expand and fuel violent extremism and social polarization in the world. In fact, today individuals who resonate with non-state armed group conduct lone wolf type of terrorism. Polarization exists not only in the real world, but also in virtual world. To contain radicalization of the youth and to create a better society, we could make more use of SNS and DX to reach out to individual people around today's context. International cooperation among the government and international agencies is indispensable. Digital transformation DX is an emerging and effective approach to improve the peace-building activities. Digital and satellite technology are likely to develop data collection in fragile and conflict-affected areas that are difficult to collect the data so far. Our case in the Mindanao or the Philippines and Uganda, JICA now consider utilizing big data of smartphone and SNS to collect data on refugee and local legend community. We also plan to use satellites for data collection on forest management because the bigger needs of firewood by refugee inflow is likely to reduce forest resources. So finally, we have a potential to reach individual young people one by using SNS and such a DX technology. We must improve relations between the government and people, turning more flat and fast and good peace building on the field, in the field. That is, thank you very much for the hearing. Thank you.
Thank you, Makino-san, for sharing your comment. Next, I'd like to ask Mr. Seiro Ito, Director of the Microeconomic Analysis Studies Group in the Development Studies Center at the JETRO Institute of Developing Economies. Mr. Ito will share his comment for next 7-8 minutes. Mr. Ito, please.
Thank you very much. First of all, I put so many words on the slides. First of all, I have to say that I'm privileged to be here to discuss the issues with you. I put so many words on the slides, but if I choose one phrase, one message to the report, that will be thank you. I'm a user. I'm a microeconomist that's working for the Institute of Developing Economies, and so I'm a user of the data. And when I come across with the situation where the data is not available for the things that I want to study, I just shrug off, and then what's not there is not there. But the team, this report has put the data on that issue on the forefront, and try to think about how to cultivate the data information, and put it scaled up at the national level, which is very important, impressive. So I'd like to congratulate you on that. But having said that, my task here is to be critical. So let me try giving some comments. So let's summarize the contributions briefly. The first, there are three contributions that I can point out. There are many, but I'll point out three. The first is novelty of the view. It takes the governance of the data generation, use, and development, as opposed to the digital technology and the applications in other existing World Bank and IFC reports, and especially what the development report in 2016. The report considers data as a factor of production, and if it's a factor of production, it needs institutions for efficient and ethical uses. So that's the contribution. First one. The second one is the broadness of the scope. The report put the pieces together. Existing literature discussed about the parts, like platform behaviors and use of AI feedback loops, competition laws, and use of non-traditional data source in assessing poverty. But no one has put them, to the best of my knowledge, in a framework of the data governance. So that's quite new to me. And also the generality of the framework. It can be applied to all the income levels. So it's good. I'll skip the recap. For this saves time, but I just want to point out that the report is pushing for the social contract. But at the same time, it admits that it's a long way to be there. So it lists it has a long list of to-do things. So obviously we're not there yet. And in most low and middle income countries, possibly except China and India, data hasn't become a product asset, thanks to little use of data and AI. And data production is predominantly from mobile phones, while data sharing is at the nascent stage. The poor are not much connected, so currently they are mostly left out of the process. And so now it's at the stage well before a social contract. My comments revolve around the feasibility. And first is what's in for the poor. The second is how can we construct a social contract and unlimited trust while protecting the poor. And third one is even if data usage complies perfectly with the social contract, there may be some cost to the data-driven economy. So the report gives a big picture of the data-driven economy, and it discusses extensively about something that's not currently accessible to the poor. They show limited use cases of private intent data based on the private demand, at the poor's demand. Let me show the examples. Okay, this is first is public intent data, which is used by the government. The first one can be termed as a cost-saving technologies, which includes poverty mapping and violence mapping, disaster prevention responses. The second can be termed as an empowering technology, which is to be used by citizens. That includes digital report aggregation to increase accountability. This is like if you see a homeless in the street, and then the citizen may take the picture and upload it, and this technology will automatically put that on a map, so you can show it to the government. It takes a voluntary reports and verification by the citizens. Digital identity is required to interact online without fraud, but this is a still work in progress technically. And examples from private intent data. This is the first one is also the cost-saving technology, which is used by commercial farms mostly, which this involves agricultural advising and forecasting services to the farms at the granular level. So this is still limited to the, this is not really used by many small-scale farms. The second one would be used by everyone, and it's based on the platforms. And the fintech products, such as mobile payments, or digital loans, or weather insurances, or supply chain management on blockchains, which is similar to contract farming, but going digital. And I put the telemedicine in the bracket because it takes I think it takes the smartphones to be able to reap the benefit of it. So let me take the most promising use case based on the first event. I took the digital loans as an example. Mobile money and phone usage data will be put into the machine learning algorithm, and it gives you the credit scores, and you may be able to get the loans. This is happening in Kenya and other countries as well. And the service provider out M-Pesa in Kenya is also providing M-Shwari, which is a digital loans. And it has 4.5 million customers in 2015. But the problem is that they offer the loans only at the high interest rates when the country is running about 6 to 7% inflation rate per annum. And Shwari, it carries 7.5% per month. So it's equivalent to 90% per annum. For Lisa, which is offshoot of the M-Shwari, this is equivalent to 395% per annum. They introduced Lisa to deal with the smaller loans, and M-Shwari is dedicated to the larger size loans. So this may conflict, this may go against the intuition of financial inclusion because they are carrying such high interest rates. So I believe this is mostly used as an emergency for short-term duration. And some of the customers in M-Shwari might have graduated to the regular finance. So it might have opened the pathway to the regular finance. But the problem with high interest rates seems to be reflecting the high default rates of the smaller loans. So there may be they may require some research to be done if the market failure has resolved with this non-traditional use of the data and providing loans on it. So AI-based credit scoring, the welfare impacts on the poor is not really obvious because of the high interest rates it's carrying. So let me go back. So for private intent data, short-term gains on the poor welfare may be limited. And there's some other cases where some improvements need to be done, such as data portability in supply chain on blockchain. Okay, my second comment is how can we construct a social contract under limited trust while protecting the poor? I think the report puts a blind faith on the government. Government may say, please enroll in a platform so we can serve you better. I promise I stay trustworthy. I also have their professional authority and the laws. And I think the majority will say yes or no. But the poor may say, no, staying online is too much for me. And the report has an extensive discussions around this issue, how to resolve this issue. Now, some may say, well, so-called informed people may say, no, aren't you already spying on me? I'm not just talking about China, but there are some people claim that our government's also, spying on us as well. That means there needs some persuasion to be done to reach an agreement, social contract. And also we need to point out about the breach of cases, over 1 billion cases of other digital identity in India. So counting on the government agency to check the misuse is not really convincing, incentive-wise or capacity-wise. So for countries without a balance of power, how can we construct an enforceable social contract under a limited trust? That's my second question. The third question is, even if data usage complies perfectly with the social contract, there are some costs to the data-driven economy as well. First is, with decreasing average costs or market failure, the growth of a data-driven economy may be inefficient. So you need to regulate that part of that segment of the economy. But can government hold monopolies in check when you cannot even tax them? So and again, it's a feasibility issue. The report touches on these issues, but not so much argument about feasibility. And okay, second is a separate issue, but some say in high-income countries, the platformers lead to customers become more aware of the prices, which leads to intensified winner-takes-most all competitions, which increase the markup of the surviving firms, which leads to declining labor shares because markup and labor shares has an inverse relationship between two. And so there's a discussion about declining labor shares in developed high-income countries, but we see that low and middle-income countries also are having declining labor share. So should we not worry about employment consequences of the data-driven economy? That's my second point of this segment. And the third one would be maybe out of scope of the report, but my digital footprints are shallow copies of myself. So is it fun to have a choice that dominated by the suggestion out of digital footprints without you knowing it? So what I imagine here is that having the poor getting richer, but all you see is that those suggestions are from your digital footprints. And it's a bit sort of disappointing picture to me as a goal of the development. So what about consumer sovereignty? That's my third point here. Okay, that's it for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ito-san, for sharing your comment. Now I would like to ask Dean and Vivian to come in and respond directly to the comments made by Makino-san and Ito-san. Dean and Vivian, please.
Sure. Vivian, is it fine if I take a first crack at this? Yeah. So thank you very much for the incredibly thoughtful comments. I think many of the comments are just incredibly useful to think about, and I'm just going to highlight some quick sort of responses on a few of the items where I can. If I go back first to Dr. Makino's comments, I will make a couple of distinctions where if I followed the comments correctly, there was sort of a suggestion that the focus of how we were talking about data was a bit too narrow, and that we were focused on digital data but weren't taking a broad enough picture of data. And I'm actually very sympathetic to that comment in general, and I think it's why we tried to build into the narrative of the report the whole sort of notion that this definition of data is particularly hard to pin down, because what was data now certainly was not data 10 years ago. We give as examples how pictures are now data, or how sounds are now data, or how many things that we would not have described as data 5 years ago are now readily converted into usable data that's used. And so I think in many of the examples of the sort of analog type data, they struck me as sort of completely consistent with the notion of what we're talking about when we talk about data in this context in the report. And so it's more just about trying to think more systematically and about how to effectively reap value in a way, in a social value sort of sense from the various sources of data, whether that's qualitative data or sort of more quantitative data as we think of it now. And completely agree with all the examples about the variety of data uses in terms of satellite data and SMS data and other sources of data as being really important sort of elements of improving public policy and the power of that to play. And on the, maybe just one more comment on thinking about the focus of the work that you had been doing on safety, prosperity, and freedom. I mean, my sense is that that's not so distinct from the framing that we're using in terms of trust, equity, and value. And I think the most important point in these cases is this sense that people need to be, when you say need to be protected, so the safety and trust seem quite sort of similar. This notion of prosperity in our sense is ensuring that everyone it creates sort of value from the transactions, or otherwise people won't participate in this. So I saw certainly some similarities, and a bit of the pitch that we're making in conversations about the report is that One, I really appreciate sort of the tone of the comments, which are to provide useful criticism, and yet, so this phrase of not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, to recognize that there's a lot of important value added in the report, and there might be areas where we can say things differently, but that we're aiming for some of the same sort of targets and objectives. And I'll switch to Professor Ito's comments. I'll just give a couple of quick reactions on those. Mostly to say that I largely agree with many of the comments. So first, this comment about not there yet, I think is exactly right. And then I hope the tone of the report conveys our sort of recognition that what we're describing is we tried to provide a mix of some sort of small step things that we think where we can make sort of genuine progress, while also offering up some very highly aspirational language and targets. In parts to sort of both to inspire people to think bigger and to sort of set, not only as we take small steps, we have to have a sense of that overall trajectory in the direction that we're going. But I don't disagree at all with the portrayal that Professor Ito had in terms of most of the countries being very far away from what we're talking about. I think this question about what is in it for the poor, I think is really central to the whole idea of a social contract. I mean, we use some of this language that if people have nothing to gain from these transactions, any sort of social contract that's set up will not be sustainable. And if that question, I think the two questions in particular that you pose, that if they cannot be answered in a credible way from the social contract, that social contract will fail. And you know, in many ways that we see governance failures in a variety of different countries, this notion of ensuring that people can see some real value in engaging in this kind of data system is really just fundamental to making progress in this data system. And so unambiguously, that's one of the big picture targets that we're setting, is that this notion of what's in it for everyone, what's in it for those who are typically excluded from these discussions, has to be a central element of discussions moving forward. So I know that's not a terribly satisfactory answer to the question you're posing, but it's ultimately just saying that, frankly, the tone of the report largely agrees with that sense, that that is a fundamental question. In the same way of how can we construct a social contract with limited trust, to me, that also is, again, a central question. And the answer is, without trust, we cannot construct a social contract that really is fundamental to any sort of contract. You know, we can write laws, but if those laws aren't trustworthy, if people don't trust the mechanisms that are in place to enforce those laws in a fair way, that social contract is not sustainable. And so, yeah, I suppose we will all differ across each of us as to which of these elements of trust, equity, and value are some of the more challenging dimensions. But I think, in my mind at least, that trust aspect, there is so much work that does need to be done, even at that fundamental level of ensuring trust in the credibility of the data, and trust in the transactions that will take place in this data, and trust that people will benefit in some way from that data. And so largely, that motivates our call for looking at what are the foundational issues linked to trust. And we do think that fundamentally a very important reason for distrust is sort of a lack of understanding of the role that data can play, or a lack of understanding simply of data. And so this notion of rethinking education, rethinking digital literacy, rethinking how people can use data, how people can benefit from data, how people can understand data, is really critical to the work that needs to be done. And this is not just for technocrats, but it's really for entire populations. And so that's a very massive undertaking as well. And so that is, I think, part of what I'm getting at is, I think the questions prompted by Professor Ito get at some of the really core, deep, fundamental issues of making progress and of moving forward. So I'm going to stop there. And Vivian, do you want to add in some comments?
Those were great responses, Dean. I can maybe add a couple of things. First of all, I wanted to agree very much with Makino-san's view regarding the potential for leapfrogging in fragile environments using big data and novel data techniques. I think challenges that have eluded us for decades using traditional statistical approaches in fragile countries are now potentially melting away as we turn to Twitter and cold detail records and so on. So very much agree with that. I found Ito-san's remarks very thought-provoking and provocative in a good way. I wanted to mention that in terms of what's in it for the poor, that this WDR is a somewhat unusual one in the sense that we're looking at a novel agenda. So we can't look to the past and sort of pronounce on what we think the evidence is telling us. We're kind of trying to look forward, and that's why we emphasize a lot the potential for data to help the poor through the various cases that we use. But what we're also trying to say is that it's only if we progress on equity that the benefits of data will reach the poor. And our current performance on equity is terrible, right? I think the report really underscores whether it's infrastructure, whether it's literacy, whether it's regulations, whether it's market power, there are massive inequities. And as long as these inequities, persist, and they may be particularly difficult to address because of the dynamics of data, then there's really a risk that data will not benefit the poor as much as we might hope, or even at all. So I think that's really the message that we want to give. I also acknowledge that the report puts blind faith in government. I think that's a very valid comment. We do write a little bit from the perspective of the benevolent state. But what I wanted to underscore is maybe two things. One is that there are potentially other actors who may be important, particularly in civil society. And I'm thinking of data intermediaries, data trusts, and various non-governmental actors, which are beginning to emerge in the data space and providing very important data facilitation services. And the other comment I want to make is around this idea of balancing enablers and safeguards. If you can't provide safeguards, then you shouldn't give too many enablers, right? Because if data can't be protected, then making it flow around easily is, very, very dangerous thing to do, right? So that's why we insist, in a sense, on the balance between these two things. You really want to make sure that you've put in the data protection before you open the floodgates, enabling the data to move. And I think that's maybe one way of thinking about how you deal with suboptimal situations, which, as you say, certainly abound in the countries where we work. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Dean and Vivian, to respond directly to Ito-san and Makino-san's comment. We received so many comments and questions from the participants, and then some of them even sent the question in advance to me. So let me try to read as many as questions and comments, and ask the Dean and Vivian and even Mala to come in to respond. The first one, specific question to Dean. You mentioned three data providers, academia, public, and private sector. Given the different quality and quantity of data, how users can correctly interpret in their end? So that's the question to Dean. The question to Vivian. As Vivian pointed out, national broadband infrastructure is still a major homework, which is almost the same since the WDR 2016. How would the World Bank consider this dilemma, and how to break through this? So that's a question to the Vivian. And let me switch into Japanese. これは一番最初にいただいた質問なんですけれども、データを利用したとしてという仮定のもとに、真のデータを利用せず、導き出したい結論のために、結論としてデータを悪用されないためには、どのような対策をしたら有効でしょうか、という質問をいただいております。はい、それから、one more question. The latest to vulnerable people, diversity and inclusion. How are the vulnerable people involved in the whole process from the planning, not only as a surveyors? So that's a vulnerable people question. And related to this, side event at the high-level political forum held in this month mentioned in the difficulties of the collecting data of the vulnerables, like we do not have the basic information like sex, LGBTQI+, because of many reasons such as illegality in some countries to answer as LGBTQI+, or even some people aren't a registered nationality. What do you think? How do you tackle with these issues? So that's the question related to vulnerable people and diversity and data. And then probably one more question to read, and I ask Dean and Vivian to respond. INDS is a very attractive vision, and I totally agree with it. However, I encountered many practitioners in developing cooperation of its cost and sustainability. Also, sometimes it is difficult to convince the policymakers to invest in it, as it takes some time to see the real benefit at the more of the application site, e.g., healthcare using personal health record, etc. What would be your advice on convincing these skeptics to work towards this vision? So these are the set of questions, and I ask Vivian and Dean, maybe Amara to come in to respond. And if we have time, we go for another round. Thank you.
Shall we? We'll stick to this. I'll go first then and hand off to Vivian. That sounds great. So first, thanks so much for summarizing the questions, Koicho. I was reading them and I was just impressed with the wide array of really thoughtful comments that are coming in. It's very exciting for us to read so many interesting questions. Let me take I see we're a little bit limited on time, so I'm going to go a little bit faster on a couple of these. The first question on how do we start talking about data quality if data is really being produced and used by academics, government, civil society, and if you have competing sources of data sort of giving what's meant to be similar information, how can people sort of make sense of that kind of data world? And I think that's a very sort of useful question. But it also sort of, in my mind, highlights the potential that data offers to sort of bring balance in some of these issues of well, for example, in this question about what are the sort of potential checks that might exist in terms of governments and the potential misuse of data. So in the report, as one example, we talk about how in some cases where governments were perceived to be reporting misinformation in terms of inflation estimates, researchers would go out and do scraping of data, price data from publicly available sources and offer sort of potential conflicting estimates of inflation, but essentially sparking an important sort of policy dialogue. So essentially questioning the quality of the data that was being released and ultimately compelling the government to take measures in response to this questioning of the data quality. Now, that response to the questioning of the data quality was to improve the transparency of their methods, to start explaining to people what they're doing and how that they produced these measures, and to start ultimately, in some of the cases, changing some of the approaches that were being used there. And so in some ways, this notion of checking data quality is something for which it will be a continuous and ongoing process. And it's something that we actually view as integral to a well-functioning integrated national data system, and that there have to be continual checks on the data quality. So not only do we view the various actors as providing checks on the credibility of the data, but we also argue that in particular with the public intent data, there needs to be investment in continual experiments on data quality. And so we offer many examples of countries that have started to invest in, as they move towards new techniques of capturing data, carrying out experiments to ensure that these new methods actually do improve the quality of the data and verifying that there are improvements in data quality. And so trying to take a much more sort of scientific approach to that process of data generation, we think is really sort of an important feature there. And finally, on the terms of data quality and what we really think of as the value of the three competing, or the three, not competing, but the three different pathways by which data can be collected and used for development objectives, is to suggest that in countries that are getting more value out of data, you're seeing closer links between government analysts and researchers. So you see much more flow of researchers going into governments and coming back out of governments, taking sabbaticals, sometimes even in government agencies, both to sort of get exposure to more important policy questions, but to understand the data, and then taking that knowledge back out with them into academics, at the same time bringing new skills into government analysts. So we think in many ways, this flow across the three different pathways of the various actors is really critical to improving the quality of data. And frankly, improving the quality of data is really central to building up greater trust in data. On this issue of vulnerable people, we do see that much of the way that many of the ways that data are collected across the different vehicles, so either through the private function or the public intent data, have different types of attributes in terms of their ability to pick up certain types of people. And we think that there needs to be a very careful analysis and understanding of the coverage of the different types of data and how lack of coverage will contaminate or bias estimates in ways that will matter quite a bit, in particular, typically for marginalized populations and vulnerable people. And so we talk about tools and methods for improving the coverage of data in ways that can help improve coverage of vulnerable populations. So particularly, and this maybe goes back to Professor Makino's comments on use of new data techniques. So certainly countries that have done a better job of capturing, for example, people living in slums are countries that have leaned on using satellite data to improve their population frames. And they use that satellite data to more effectively update and ensure that their census frames are more reflective of the entire population and don't exclude vulnerable people. But I do think that ability to capture vulnerable people will be a really important element in terms of thinking about improving the data capture techniques moving forward. So I didn't succeed in being short, but I did want to drill down in that because I do think data quality is really an important feature, and it is a feature that we talk a fair amount about in the World Development Report. Vivian?
Thanks very much, Dean. I'd like to address the question on backbone infrastructure that was posed. And it's true that while there has been a great deal of progress in the rollout of broadband infrastructure, it remains a work in progress. If we look at many developing countries, we find that a lot of the, if you like, standard policy prescriptions for the supply side of the sector have yet to be fully implemented. We find that many markets are still rather concentrated and don't have adequate amounts of competition. We find the state still sometimes playing quite a large role in a sector that is proven to be much better managed by the private sector. And we see certain important regulatory gaps, particularly in areas like infrastructure sharing, which are a good way of reducing the cost of rolling out broadband infrastructure, as well as in the allocation of spectrum and the way that spectrum is priced and regulated. So I think that a lot of the, if you like, traditional prescriptions on the supply side have yet to be fully adopted. However, I do think there's an important interaction between the demand side and the supply side, because if private investors roll out broadband infrastructure and only 20% of the population takes up the service, that's obviously not going to be a viable model, and it's not going to support a lot of competition. So I think that in the future, we hope to see a more balanced addressing of the supply side and the demand side to create a kind of virtuous circle between those two sides of the market. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Because of the limitation of the time, I don't think we might be able to go another round of the discussion. But we received so many comments, and then I was not able to go for the questions such as the data and the people's dignity, private sector, and how to encourage them to share data. Big data management and the major company, and concern on the emerging hegemonic countries and controlling data by them, and the potential role of the international organization there. But I understand also, Dean and Vivian and Mala, you also are sort of reading those questions posed by the participant. So in the final round, I would like to invite Makino-san and Ito-san first to make a very final comment, and then Mala, in order of Mala and Vivian and Dean to say few words, hopefully including some responses and comments to the question that you see on the screen, and then we wrap up a seminar. So Makino-san, would you please go ahead to say a few final words? Thank you.
Yeah, very quickly, I highly appreciate the World Bank to jointly hold such a beautiful, excellent the seminar today. Thank you very much. And also appreciation towards the WDR team, and then the detail and the kind way to correspond to my comments. So thank you very much. Especially the safety, prosperity, the freedom as the core of the social the contract from our side is quite similar with the World Bank the value. Yeah. Anyway, thank you very much today.
Thank you, Makino-san. Ito-san, please.
Thank you very much for your replies. I'm totally with you about that. That we need to be forward-looking and try to eliminate all the hurdles. And so I'd like to congratulate on that, on tackling the issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mala, you observed the discussion, so please come in to say a few words.
Sure, thank you. It was such an interesting discussion. Thank you so much. And thank you, Makino-san and Ito-san. I think you've left us sort of with several questions for us to go back and think about. Maybe I'll respond to very quickly to a couple of things in the report that we pointed out. I think, Ito-san, you talked about this issue of incentives and checks and balances in a way, and how do we do that especially in environments that struggle with regulatory or institutional capacity issues. So one of the things, I think we discussed that at different levels. Of course, Vivian and Dean talked about data literacy, but we focus, we're a little biased in the discussions from the view of the governments, but I think fundamentally, I think within governments, this notion of creating incentive structures for people at the technical level to be able to use data and understand the value of data is really important. So, there are several discussions that now are coming up around data stewardship being recognized as a professional stream. So this is at the technical level. But then, of course, we have the issue at a more political level, at the country level or the international data governance level, where, again, there have been several discussions. There's been call for a global consensus, similar to, an institution that could help navigate agreements between countries or standards and principles that we can create checks and balances. Microsoft is called for this. Rockefeller Foundation is calling for a series of dialogues. They're even calling for an institution similar to Bretton Woods on AI. So I think these conversations are going to evolve to see how we come together to create that checks and balances in a way that all actors are able to participate and derive value from the social contract. And then on one final point, there are some interesting examples we were able to bring in terms of how other actors outside of government, especially the role of civil society in even collecting and producing and using data, especially for vulnerable groups. We have one particular example from the Amazon basin, where a huge citizen science network, I think they have about, 100 groups of citizen scientists that includes fishermen, indigenous peoples, local communities, who've worked with 25 academic and grassroots organizations from across 7 countries to form to create the first database on fisheries, which is, as you know, is really essential for these communities that are dependent on income that comes from fishing. So this is another example of how you have different actors who can come together to involve communities that are generally not part of, you know, a regular data transaction, or you know, not engaged through digital footprint data or otherwise. Also, there are other ways that are being practiced as well to bring these people into the data, what do you say, economy. With that, I just want to say that we just hope that we can continue to have such dialogues as we kind of work our way to meet the ambitious goal of INDS in countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Vivian, please.
Thank you very much. And, you know, it's difficult to compete with the Olympics, but I'm impressed with the level of engagement that we've had this morning. So thank you so much to everybody. I wanted to pick up in my final remarks a very important question that was raised about how to get access to private intent data. I think this is critical because when it comes to government data, we have made quite a lot of progress with open data legislation, access to information legislation. There are still some issues, but you know, I think progress has been made. But when it comes, but nowadays, most of the data is being produced by private actors. And at present, few of them have much incentive to share that data. There is some data partnerships, there's some corporate social responsibility, but by and large, often the very commercial interest goes against the sharing of this data, which is becoming increasingly vital for a wide range of functions. We've seen some interesting experiments in smart cities, but it's been difficult. I think recent legislation in countries like France with the Digital Republic Act have been quite interesting in that they basically identify certain types of private intent data which are deemed to be of public interest and which require to be shared under suitable circumstances with public sector actors. So for me, this is a huge area, and I think it's one we'll have to watch closely in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Vivian. Dean, please.
Sure, thanks so much. I was reading on the side, I'll just want one quick comment that I didn't address before, but the question was, how do you convince skeptics of something like an integrated national data system? And I won't give the answer here because it's a bit too long, but I do think it's worth recognizing that there's been a long history of thinking about data more systematically in the statistics literature that I think really provides nice examples of how being more systematic in our use of data has improved lives. And this goes back to, in the report in certain drafts, we had a lot of emphasis on Florence Nightingale's work. And if we think about what she really did, was lots of people were dying in hospitals in part because there was no systematic use of data that was flowing in. Hospitals kept lots of administrative data, but across hospitals, there was no standardization in terms of how deaths were being codified and how treatments were being codified and created in typologies. And really, I think probably one of her biggest contributions to statistics was this emphasis on thinking about building interoperability of data across hospital data records in ways that really just fundamentally changed public health in ways that, if you are willing to think sort of big picture, she changed the way that public health did research, that public health used data. She had a very broad and grand vision of how data could be used to save lives, and probably you could pin millions of lives being saved to her sort of insights in this. And so clearly what we're offering is a very sort of aspirational vision, but it's not a process that hasn't started, and it's not a process that we haven't seen lots of success of thinking more systematically about using data to make people's lives better. This exists and it's going on, and we just really want to underline that we're at a moment now where we could really make a large shift in terms of trying to move the focus away from just collecting more data and thinking harder about, well, how do we realize greater value for the social good and the use of that data? And if we can sort of help to shift the focus a little bit more in that direction, I think I will feel that we've made some really important progress. And maybe if I can just end then by saying that there are so many just really provocative and important questions coming out. And these are many questions that we've had long conversations within our team on. In some cases, they are unanswerable. In other cases, we've written up what we hope is our best answer in the report. So we hope that people have a chance to read that report. And I just also want to say that this is maybe a seminar where I think we've received some of the most thoughtful comments coming from the Q&A and also from our commenters. So I just really want to go back and thank our commenters for really the thoughtful and provocative feedback. It's really useful to help us think about these questions, but also as we go further and talk with other people, the critiques that we're hearing now hopefully help us to build a stronger case for the argument that we're trying to make. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dean. With us from Washington, two co-directors of the WDR, Dean Jolliffe and Vivian Foster, and the WDR manager, Mala Berapan. And from Tokyo side, we had the Mr. Koji Makino from the JICA Ogata Research Institute, and Mr. Seiro Ito from the JETRO Institute of Developing Economies. Thank you very much, everyone, and to join us. And thank you all the speakers and commentators being with us this morning. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, so please check the update information about the online event by the JICA Research Institute on JICA website, and then those events by the World Bank on the World Bank Tokyo office website. The interesting online seminars are coming up. With that, stay safe, stay healthy, and thank you very much. See you next time.